In this lecture, we are going to learn about model validation and how to validate a value coming for a property of the model class. Here I am in the book model class. Here we are going to create a new property, and this property is going to be of type string, and I am going to call this property book name. Now we want this book name property to be a required field. So basically, whenever a request will be made to this action method, we are going to provide some value for the properties of this book model class, right? So when we are providing a value for this book model class, at that time, the value for the book name property is mandatory. It is required. If the book name value is not supplied, that means the data is not valid. And in that case, we might want to return bad request in the response. One way to do that is to write if else statement. So here I can write this if statement, and in the condition I can use string dot is null or empty, and there I can pass book name. So here I can say book dot book name. So if this book name is null or empty, we are not going to accept that value for the book name. So in that case, we are going to return bad request. So this is one way of doing that. Here we are validating the value of this book name property. If the book name is not supplied, in that case it will be either null or it will be empty string. So in that case, we want to return a bad request, and if we want, we can also return some error message. For example, we can say book name is a required field, something like this. But instead of doing it like this, let me go ahead and let me remove this if statement from here. What we can do is we can validate our data in the model class itself. And for that, we need to import a namespace, and the namespace is system.componentModel.data annotation. So we need to import this namespace, and this library, this namespace provides a lot of attribute classes which we can use on a property in order to validate it. For example, we have an attribute called required, and when we are using this required above this book name, this required is basically a class. So what it will do is it will make this book name property as required property. So whenever this model class will be instantiated, it makes it mandatory that we provide a value for this book name. Otherwise, the model data will be invalid. So with this, if I go ahead and if I run this application, so the application is running now. Let's go to Postman, and from there, let's make a request to this root URL /books. So when I make a post request here, currently we are passing value for book ID, which is 560, and author Jonas. But we are not providing a value for the book name. But in our book model class, we also have a property called book name, which is a required property. And for that, we are not passing any value. So if I make this request, the breakpoint will hit here on this book action method. And here, if I hover over this book here, and if I expand it, you will see that this author has a value Jonas. It has the value for book ID, which is 560, but book name is null. But book name is a required field. So here, what it will do is it will make this book model invalid, but it will not stop it from sending the response. So if I press F10, you see we are able to send the response from here. And in the response, we have book ID is 560, author is Jonas. So keep in mind that when we specify an attribute like this on a property, it will not stop the model property to be filled with invalid data. So this book name will be filled with invalid data, in this case null, but it will make this complete model as invalid. So here what has happened is, since this book name has a value null, and null is an invalid value for this book name because this book name is a required field, it will make this complete model as invalid. And this is happening because keep in mind that first the model binding happens. So here the model binding will happen, and whatever value we have received for the properties of this book model, that will be assigned to those properties. In this case, null will be assigned to this book name, 560 will be assigned to this book ID, and Jonas will be assigned to this author. So first the model binding will happen. And once the model binding has happened, then only the model validation will happen. And when the model validation will happen, this book name has received an invalid value, because in this case null is an invalid value. So what it will do is it will make this complete book model as invalid. So now what we can do is we can go to our action method, and there we can write an if statement, and here we will have access to a property called model state. Okay, and this model state has a property called is valid. So when the model is invalid, in that case this is valid property will be set to false. In our case, the model is invalid because this book name property has received an invalid value. So it will make this complete model as invalid. And in that case, this is valid will be false. This is valid will be true only when all the properties of that model has received the valid value. Okay, so here we can say that if model is not valid, so here I'm going to use this not operator. So if the model is not valid, we want to return bad request. Now, what is the advantage here? The advantage here is that earlier we were checking if book name is null or empty. In that case, we were returning the bad request. In the same way, let's say if author is also a required field, so we will have to write another if statement, and there we will check if author is null or empty. In that case, return bad request. So for all the required fields, we will have to write an if statement to check if that property has received a value or not, whether it is null or empty. If it is null or empty, we will return bad request. Otherwise, we will process it further, right? So we will have to do it for each property. But now in this case, if any property has received an invalid value, this single if condition will return false. That means this is valid will return false. And on that, we are using this not operator, which will make it true. And this complete condition will become true. And in that case, we are returning a bad request. So in this way, we don't have to validate each and every field one by one. Okay, so that is the advantage here. And from here, we can also return some response. So let's say some field values are not valid. Okay, let's run this again. Let's go to Postman and let's make a request again. Again, I'm not providing any value for the book name. When I click on the send button, the breakpoint has hit here. Let's say F10. So book ID has a value F10. Now in this case, since we have not provided a value for the book name, you see this is valid is false. Okay, because in the model, in this book model, we are not receiving a valid value for this book name property. So it has made this complete model invalid. In that case, this is valid is going to return false. And on that, we are using this not operator. So this condition will become true. The control will go inside this if statement. And then from here, we are returning bad request. So in the Postman, you can see some field values are not valid. But if I provide a value for the book name, let's say book name is test. And now if I make a request, in that case, you will notice that this is valid is true. So now the model is valid because for each of the property, we have received a valid value. Currently, we are only validating one field, which is this book name, and it is a required field. And since we have provided a value for this book name, this model is valid. So if I step in, you see, it will not go inside this if statement and it will return this content in the response. So here we have the response. All right. Now, apart from this is valid property, we have two more properties on this model state. So keep in mind that this is valid property will return false if any model property value is invalid. It returns true only when all the model property values are valid. Then we also have another property on the model state called values. And values is a list which contains each property of the model and corresponding validation errors which has happened on that model property. We will see this with an example. And finally, we also have another property called error count, and this error count gives us the total number of errors that has happened on the model. So now what we want is, instead of sending this text in the response, we want to send the actual validation error in the response. For that, here, let me go ahead and let me use for each loop. And what we are going to do is, we are going to loop over the values property of the model state. So here, let me create a variable. I will call it value in model state dot value. Okay, it is values. So we are going to loop over this values list. Now, as I mentioned, this values is a list which contains each property of the model. In this case, this values will contain these three properties and also the validation error that has happened on these properties. Okay, so let me actually run this application again. Let's go to Postman and let's make a request. Let me uncheck this book name. So now we are only sending book ID with a value and author with a value. We are not sending book name with any value. So in this case, again, the book name will be null. If I make a request, let me put a breakpoint here and let me continue. So if I hover over this values and if I hover over this result, you see here we have three items in this values list, and each item has this key, which is the property name, in this case author, the value for that property, and then we also have this errors property here. And again, this errors is a list. So this errors will contain all the validation errors that has happened on that property. In this case, in case of author, we don't have any validation errors. So this errors count is 0. But if I expand the third item from this list where the key is book name, here you see the attempted value is null. And this book name is a required field. And for that, we have supplied the value as null. So in that case, if you see here, we have this errors property and the count is 1. And if I expand this, let me expand this as well. Here you can see the error message. And the error message says the book name field is required. So we can use this errors list, and from that we can get the error message and we can send that in the response. And that's what we are going to do here. So inside this for each loop, I will write another for each. And this time we are going to loop over the errors list. So each value here is going to have an errors property, which is going to be a list. And we are going to loop over that list and we are going to get all the errors for that particular property. And then we will send it in the response. So let me create another variable. I will call it error in value dot errors. Now let me first go ahead and let me create a list here. So I'll create a list of string. I'll call it errors equals new list of string. And what we are going to do is here we are going to add each error message inside this errors list. So here I will say errors dot add, and we want to add the error message. So this error object here, it is going to have an error message property, and we are adding it to this errors list. Again, when we are looping over this values is going to contain a list of all the properties which we have defined in the model class. So here we are looping over each property one by one. On each property, we are checking the list of errors that has happened. And then we are adding it to this errors list. So finally, what we are going to do is, in this errors list, we are going to have a list of errors. Currently, we will have only one error when we are not going to supply a book name, but we might have multiple errors on the same model, right? So we want to combine all those errors. For that, we are going to use a method. So we have a method called join on this string type. Okay. And here we need to specify how we want to join. Basically, we need to specify the separator in this case. So in this case, the separator will be a line break. So what we want is after each error message, we want to have a line break and then we want to display the another error message. Okay. And then we can specify the list which we want to join. In this case, we want to join the errors list. Basically, this join method is going to join all the string values inside a list by a separator. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's assign that string value, the string value which we will get after joining all the error messages, into a variable. I will call it maybe error messages. Okay, and let's go ahead and let's return this error messages in the response. So to this bat request method, I will pass that error message. Let's reload this application. And let's go to Postman and let's make a request again. And if you notice, I'm not providing a value for the book name. Let's make the request. So the breakpoint has hit here. Let me continue. Is valid should be false because we have not supplied the value for book name. Now let's debug this code line by line. So here we are creating a list of errors. Then we are going to loop over each property. This values is a list which is going to contain all the properties of the model class and also the corresponding validation error messages for that property. So here, let me go ahead and let me press F10. And if we check this value, you see the key is author and validation state is valid. Let me actually expand this. Okay, so key is author. It has this value Jonas and we have this validation state. So this property is valid. We have received a valid value for this property and errors count is 0. So let me press F10 again. So here there is no error. Now the next property will be checked. The next property is book ID. So if I expand this, you can see the key is book ID. Attempted value is 560. Validation state, it is valid. And errors count is 0. So again, there is no error for this book ID property. So again, if we press F10, since there is no error, it will not go inside this for each. And finally, we have the third property. And the third property is book name. And its value is null. And you can see the validation state here is invalid. And the errors count is 1. So if I expand this errors count, here we have the error message. And the error message is the book name field is required. So if I press F10, now we have an error inside this errors list. So you can see that error object. If I expand this, here we have the error message. So it will go inside this for each and it will add that error message to this errors list. This errors list which we are creating here. And then the loop is complete. And now what we are doing is we are joining all the error messages inside this errors list. Currently we have only one message. So that error message will be joined and it will be assigned to this error messages variable. And finally, we are returning that error messages in the response. So here you see we have the response. The book name field is required. But if I go ahead and if I specify the book name and now if I make a request, in that case there will be no validation errors. So let me actually debug this. So here this is valid is true. That means the model is valid. So it will not go inside this if statement and this content will be returned in the response. All right, let's go back to Visual Studio. Let me stop debugging here and let's also modify this response. So after the book ID, let's also add a line break and then let's say book name equals book name. Okay. Now, currently the error message which we are receiving, it is not a custom validation error message. So we are receiving a default error message, which is book name is required, right? But here we can also specify a custom error message. For that, after this required, you can specify parentheses like this, and there you can use a named parameter called error message. And you can specify your own custom error message. And here you can say book name is a required field, something like this. So if I run this application again, let's go to Postman and let's not supply the value for this book name and let's make a request and I'll simply continue here. So now you can see we are receiving the custom validation error message, which is book name is a required field. Now here inside this error message, we will also have access to this property name. Okay, so here what I can do is I can specify a placeholder as 0. So in this case, this 0 will be replaced with the property name. Let's actually see that. So let's run this again. Let's go to Postman. Let's make a request. Let's continue here. And you see, book name is a required field. So that placeholder has been replaced with this property name. Okay, here this placeholder, it has been replaced with this property name. But if you notice, in the response there is no space between book name. Okay, but what we want is, we want to have a space between book and name. Now for that, what we can do is, we can add another attribute here, which is display, and there we can specify a name. So you can use this named parameter called name, and you can specify the value for that. So here we want to call it as book name. So now this 0, this placeholder, it will not get replaced by this book name property, but it will be replaced by this display name. So let me reload this application. Let's go to Postman. Let's make the request again without providing the book name. Let me continue here. And now you can see we have a space between book and name. So now this placeholder here, it is being replaced by this display name and not the property name. Alright, so keep in mind that when the request will be received by this action method, first the model binding will happen. That means all the properties of the model class will be assigned with the values which we have supplied, even though the values are invalid. Only after the model binding is complete, the data validation attributes will be executed. So once the model binding has happened, after that only these data validation attributes will be executed. And keep in mind that these attributes are actually classes. And while performing the model validation, it will consider all the model validation attributes that are added in the model class, and it finds out which property values are valid and which are not. If all the properties of the model class has received a valid value, in that case, the complete model will be valid. But if any property has received an invalid value, in that case, the complete model will be invalid. Alright, so this is all from this lecture. In the next lecture, let's talk about some more data validation attributes.